We are going to read little bits from this book, These Are the Galleys, which will be out in the spring. So I think we should just plunge in, John, and I'm going to read, first of all, from a letter written to John on December 14th, 2008. And it begins with the second paragraph. Your reference to the film festival reminded me of a curious story I would like to share with you. It dates back to 1997, when I was a member of the jury at Cannes. It happened to be the 50th anniversary of the festival, and the organizers decided to gather together as many prize winners from the past as possible and have them sit for a large group photograph. For some reason, jury members were asked to participate as well, which was how I wound up in that picture of more than 100 people. I'm looking at the photo now, and among the directors I recognize are Antonioni, Almodovar, Vaidya, John Borman, David Lynch, Tim Burton, Jane Campion, Altman, Wenders, Polanski, Coppola, the Coen brothers, Mike Leigh, Bertolucci, and Scorsese. The actors include Gina Lollobrigida, exclamation mark, Lauren Bacall, Johnny Depp, Vittorio Gassman, Claudia Cardinale, Liv Ullmann, Charlotte Rampling, Bibi Anderson, Vanessa Redgrave, Irene Jacob, Helen Mirren, Jean Moreau, and Angelica Houston. Before we took our places for the photo, there was a cocktail reception that lasted for about an hour. I'm not sure I've ever stood in a room more charged with human electricity. It felt as if everyone there wanted to meet and talk to everyone else, that the excitement generated by such a gathering had turned these stars and legends into a mass of hyperactive school children. I was introduced to a number of people, had short conversations with some of them, and then, in the swirling mayhem, found myself shaking the hand of Charlton Heston. Of all the people in that room, he was the one I was least interested in talking to. Not only did I think he was a bad actor, stiff, unconvincing, pompous, but I found his politics abhorrent. You probably know about his involvement with the National Rifle Association and his putrid right-wing pronouncements, which always seemed to get a lot of attention from the American press. But what could I do? It was neither the time nor the place to challenge him, and before long I realized I was trapped. Heston had no idea who I was, of course, but he too, infected by the electricity in the room, was in high spirits, and he appeared to enjoy talking to me. He talked, and I listened. And for the next 10 or 15 minutes, he reminisced about his earlier visits to Cannes, his long career in the movies, how wonderful he thought this gathering was, and how humbled he felt in the presence of all these remarkably talented people. In spite of my prejudice against him, I had to admit that in some ways he was, quote, a perfectly nice guy. The festival ended a few days later, and I went home to New York. 2 or 3 days after that, I went to Chicago. I had promised my American publisher to attend the annual Book Expo event in order to give a reading from a book of mine that was due to come out in the fall. I arrived on a Saturday. After checking into my hotel, I took a cab to the McCormick Center, which is an enormous place, I discovered, probably the size of 50 airplane hangars, and every inch of the floor was crammed with publishers' booths, hundreds and hundreds of booths, perhaps thousands. By the time I found my way to the Henry Holt stand, my bladder was nearly bursting. Someone pointed me in the direction of the men's room, about 1.5 miles away, and off I went, walking briskly down one aisle after another, passing scores of publishers' booths in the process, and just as I was approaching my destination, I glanced to my right, and there, sitting at a table signing books, was Charlton Heston, the same Charlton Heston I had met in Cannes a week earlier. The banner above him read National Rifle Association. Needless to say, I didn't stop to exchange pleasantries. The perfectly nice guy was back in his element, and I had no desire to talk to him. Nevertheless, I felt rattled. What were the odds, I wondered, of meeting a man at a French film festival and then, just a few days later, running into him again at a book fair in Chicago? I did my reading and flew home the next morning, Sunday. The following day, Monday, I was scheduled to have lunch in Manhattan with the French actress Juliette Binoche, who was considering whether to accept a role in the film I was preparing, Lulu on the Bridge. That is another story and far too complicated to go into here. I arrived at her hotel a little past noon, a small, elegant, very expensive place on Madison Avenue called The Mark. I announced myself at the front desk and then ambled around the lobby as I waited for JB to come downstairs. No one else was there except for the clerk behind the desk and myself. The lobby was deserted. After a minute or so, the elevator door opened and out stepped a man, a large old man, somewhat bent over, who walked with slow, shuffling steps. He began moving in my direction, and an instant later I realized that I was looking at Charlton Heston. He glanced up, took note of my presence, and stopped. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Wagging his finger at me and beginning to smile, he said, "I know you from somewhere, don't I?" "We met at Cannes last week," I said. "We talked for a little while before the group photo session." "Ah, of course," he said, smiling in earnest now and reaching out to shake my hand. "So good to see you again." I didn't bother to mention Chicago. He asked me how I was doing. "Fine," I said, "just fine." "And you?" I asked. "How have you been doing?" "Fine," he said, "just fine." And then he shuffled on past and went outside through the revolving door. What am I to make of this, John? Do things like this happen to you? Or am I the only one? Paul.